The property had never been flashy, and that was exactly why it had survived untouched for so long. A modest stretch of land on the edge of a planned community, bordered by old trees and uneven fencing, it looked forgettable to anyone driving past too quickly. The owner had inherited it years earlier, paid the taxes without fail, and visited just often enough to keep it from feeling abandoned. Nothing about it suggested conflict, and yet it sat directly in the path of something much larger that had been quietly taking shape for years. The homeowners association that governed the surrounding neighborhood had a reputation most people would never believe. It was organized, transparent, and unusually restrained for a body with that much authority. Meetings were documented, funds were audited, and enforcement notices were rare enough that residents often joked about forgetting they even lived under an HOA. That reputation was the reason no one questioned what happened next, because when rules are enforced fairly long enough, people stop assuming malice. The issue began with a survey update that appeared routine on paper. Boundary markers were rechecked as part of a long-term infrastructure assessment, a process meant to prevent disputes before development plans advanced any further. The association had learned the hard way years earlier that assumptions about land ownership led to lawsuits, so this time everything was measured twice, verified, and archived. What the updated survey revealed did not cause alarm at first, only confusion, because the recorded boundaries did not align with what had been assumed for over a decade. A portion of land long believed to be absorbed into the surrounding development was still privately owned. The oversight had not been intentional, but it was significant enough that it could not be ignored. The association flagged it internally, logged the discrepancy, and followed its own procedures to address it carefully. No notices were sent, no enforcement actions were taken, and no assumptions were made about intent. The goal was clarification, not confrontation. The woman who first noticed the discrepancy was not the caricature people later turned her into. She was meticulous, detail-oriented, and deeply invested in keeping the association legally protected. Years earlier, she had watched a neighboring community collapse under lawsuits that could have been avoided with proper oversight, and she had sworn never to let that happen again. Her role required precision, not popularity, and she accepted that trade-off without complaint. What made the situation volatile was timing. Development pressure in the area had reached a breaking point, and multiple outside investors were circling nearby parcels of land with growing interest. The association had already rejected several proposals that would have compromised drainage systems and green spaces, decisions that earned quiet respect from residents but frustration from developers. Any unresolved land issue, no matter how small, could be exploited by the wrong people if it lingered too long.
The property owner was notified through official channels, in writing, with documentation attached, and no demands made. The notice outlined the discrepancy, requested verification of records, and emphasized cooperation over enforcement. It was not a threat, not an accusation, and not a violation notice. It was a formality designed to protect everyone involved, even if it felt intrusive to someone who had grown accustomed to being left alone. Outside observers would later claim this was where everything went wrong, but in reality, nothing had happened yet. No one had lost anything, no rights had been challenged. The situation existed only as an unresolved question sitting quietly in a file. What transformed it into something else entirely was not the association's actions, but how the story began to spread before the facts had time to settle. Rumors filled the gaps where patience should have been. Online forums lit up with speculation, screenshots of partial documents, and dramatic assumptions about intent. The association's insistence on process was reframed as aggression, and the woman overseeing the review became a symbol rather than a person. The word Karen appeared first as a joke, then as an accusation, and finally as a verdict passed by people who had never seen the full record.
The irony was that the association slowed everything down precisely to avoid harm. Legal counsel was consulted, development proposals were paused, and internal votes were delayed until ownership could be clarified beyond dispute. These decisions protected the property owner more than anyone else, but restraint does not make headlines. Silence looks suspicious when people expect outrage, and caution is often mistaken for concealment. By the time the property owner realized how widely the narrative had spread, the story had already solidified in the public imagination. What should have been a quiet administrative correction had become a moral drama, complete with heroes and villains chosen in advance. And while everyone believed the association had gone too far, the truth was far less comfortable because the real threat had not revealed itself yet. Unseen by the people arguing online, external interests were watching closely. They understood zoning law, land valuation, and most importantly, human behavior. They knew that confusion created opportunity and that public outrage could be redirected if handled carefully. As long as attention stayed fixed on the association, no one would notice the pressure building elsewhere or the documents quietly changing hands behind the scenes. The first section of the story ended without resolution, without confrontation, and without anyone realizing how close they were to something irreversible. The property still stood, the association still followed procedure, and the woman at the center of the storm continued doing her job with the same precision as always. Everyone thought the line had already been crossed, but in reality, no one had reached it yet. The attention surrounding the property grew louder while the real movement stayed deliberately quiet. Behind the scenes, records were being requested from county offices, archived plats were being compared, and timestamps were checked with the kind of precision that left no room for improvisation. The association's leadership insisted on verifying every historical reference, knowing that even a minor inconsistency could later be weaponized by outside parties. What appeared to the public as hesitation was in fact containment, a deliberate effort to keep the situation from being rushed into the hands of opportunists. The property owner, increasingly unsettled by the noise online, began reviewing their own records more carefully than ever before. Tax receipts confirmed uninterrupted payments, inheritance paperwork was intact, and historical boundaries aligned perfectly with the older surveys the association had uncovered. On paper, ownership was unquestionable, which made the escalating speculation feel surreal. There was no hidden agenda, no lapse, no technicality waiting to swallow the land. And yet the pressure continued to build, fueled less by facts than by repetition. What few people noticed was how abruptly development interest intensified. Within weeks of the discrepancy becoming public knowledge, informal inquiries turned into aggressive expressions of intent. Adjacent land values spiked overnight. Speculative assessments circulated among private firms, and suddenly the property was being described as pivotal rather than peripheral. The association flagged the shift immediately, recognizing the familiar pattern of external influence moving faster than the law could comfortably follow. The woman at the center of the storm documented everything. She logged calls that went unanswered, emails that arrived without signatures, and sudden changes in language from groups that previously showed little interest in the area. These were not mistakes or coincidences. They were pressure tactics designed to create urgency where none legally existed. She understood that the fastest way to lose control of a situation was to let impatience dictate action, and so she slowed the process even further.
That decision frustrated nearly everyone involved. Residents grew restless, convinced the association was withholding information. Online commenters framed the delay as arrogance or overreach, and the label attached to her hardened into something easier to repeat than reconsider. The narrative had escaped her control entirely, and she knew that responding publicly would only feed it. Silence was safer, even if it made her appear guilty to those who had already decided she was.
Meanwhile, a consulting firm with no formal ties to the association began circulating alternative interpretations of the boundary issue. Their assessments contradicted both historical records and the most recent surveys, yet they were presented with polished certainty that appealed to people unfamiliar with land law. These reports spread quickly, shared as proof that the association's findings were flawed or biased. What was not mentioned was who had commissioned the reports or why they had appeared so suddenly. The association's legal counsel traced the documents back to a development consortium that had previously been denied approval for nearby expansion. Their interest in the property was not new, but their methods had grown more sophisticated. Rather than challenge ownership directly, they aimed to destabilize perception, making the land seem legally uncertain long enough to force a settlement or acquisition under pressure. It was a strategy that relied on confusion rather than courts. Recognizing the danger, the association took an unusual step. They filed a formal notice with the county affirming the property owner's rights based on verified records, effectively freezing any third-party claims until the matter was resolved. The move was quiet, procedural, and legally sound, but it had immediate consequences. Development inquiries stopped abruptly, and the speculative chatter from professional channels fell silent almost overnight. Public reaction, however, went in the opposite direction. The filing was misinterpreted as an attempt to control the property rather than protect it. Social media commentary intensified, accusing the association of manipulating bureaucracy to assert dominance. The irony was sharp and bitter, because the very action designed to shield the owner was being used as evidence against the people who took it. The property owner finally understood that passivity was no longer neutral. While their rights remained intact, their reputation was being shaped by voices louder than facts. They began cooperating more closely with the association, sharing documentation, timelines, and historical context that reinforced the legal clarity of the situation. This collaboration was not strategic theater, it was a necessary alignment against forces that benefited from their division. As records accumulated, a clearer picture emerged of how long the land had been targeted. Archived correspondence revealed inquiries dating back years, each time dismissed due to clear ownership. What had changed was not the land's status, but the environment surrounding it. Rising demand, shrinking inventory, and aggressive investment culture had turned patience into a liability for those unwilling to bend rules. Unbeknownst to most observers, the development consortium had not withdrawn. They had simply changed tactics, shifting focus from ownership to influence. The next move would not target the property directly, but the systems protecting it. And when that pressure surfaced, it would test whether integrity could withstand sustained distortion without breaking. Pressure rarely announces itself all at once, and when it arrived again, it did so through channels that felt unrelated at first. Routine audits were suddenly scheduled earlier than expected. Regulatory reviews multiplied without clear cause, and minor administrative processes that usually took days began stretching into weeks. None of these interruptions violated any rules, but together they created friction designed to exhaust rather than confront. The association recognized the pattern immediately because disruption disguised as procedure was a familiar tactic in contested developments. The property owner felt the weight of that pressure most acutely. Mail arrived more frequently, filled with requests for clarification that duplicated information already provided.
Financial institutions began asking questions about land valuation that made no sense given the frozen status of the parcel. Even insurance inquiries shifted tone, hinting at uncertainty where none legally existed. Each interaction was polite, professional, and technically appropriate, yet collectively they conveyed a message that patience was becoming expensive.
The association compiled a comprehensive report outlining the chain of interest, the misinformation attempts, and the procedural safeguards that had been activated. It was prepared not for public consumption, but for regulatory oversight should it become necessary. Every page was cross-referenced, every claim supported by primary documentation. If the situation escalated, they intended to be ready long before it reached a courtroom. The woman whose name had become shorthand for overreach remained largely invisible during this phase. She attended meetings, signed filings, and answered inquiries with the same measured consistency she always had. What changed was her understanding of how easily structure could be misunderstood in an environment hungry for villains. She was no longer surprised by the accusations, only by how quickly order itself could be framed as aggression. By the end of the second phase, the property was more secure than it had ever been on paper, yet more vulnerable than it had ever been in perception. The association had positioned itself as a barrier against exploitation, but the public still saw an obstacle rather than a safeguard. The true conflict was no longer about land boundaries, but about who controlled the narrative surrounding them.
The property owner felt the weight of that pressure most acutely. Mail arrived more frequently, filled with requests for clarification that duplicated information already provided. Financial institutions began asking questions about land valuation that made no sense given the frozen status of the parcel. Even insurance inquiries shifted tone, hinting at uncertainty where none legally existed. Each interaction was polite, professional, and technically appropriate, yet collectively they conveyed a message that patience was becoming expensive. The association responded by tightening its internal controls even further. Access to records was restricted, communication protocols were standardized, and every interaction involving the property was logged with time, date, and source. These measures were not defensive theater. They were a recognition that the next phase would not involve overt challenges, but subtle attempts to manufacture doubt. The goal was no longer to seize land directly, but to make ownership feel burdensome enough that surrender appeared reasonable. What altered the trajectory again was an inconsistency discovered during one of those unexpected audits. A development-linked consulting firm had submitted overlapping documentation to two different agencies, each version containing slightly altered boundary descriptions. On their own, the discrepancies were small enough to be dismissed as clerical errors. Viewed together, they formed a pattern that suggested deliberate ambiguity rather than mistake. The association flagged the issue and escalated it beyond the local level. This escalation did not become public immediately, but its effects were felt. Requests slowed, inquiries stopped, and the previously relentless administrative pressure paused without explanation. Behind closed doors, regulators began comparing submissions, timestamps, and authorization trails that did not align as cleanly as they should have. The consulting firm that had fueled much of the confusion became unresponsive, withdrawing its assessments and redirecting blame toward unnamed subcontractors. The property owner was briefed privately on the findings, not as reassurance, but as preparation. What had started as a boundary clarification had evolved into a broader examination of influence, misrepresentation, and coordinated narrative shaping. Ownership of the land was no longer the central issue. It was now evidence within a much larger framework of behavior. The association's role shifted from mediator to witness, documenting events that extended well beyond its original jurisdiction. Public perception lagged behind reality.
Online commentary continued recycling the earlier version of events, largely unaware that the story had already moved past its most visible characters. The woman at the center of the criticism remained the easiest symbol to attack, even as decisions were increasingly being made by entities far removed from her authority. She understood this disconnect, but she also understood that correcting it prematurely could compromise processes already in motion. As the investigation deepened, previously unrelated disputes in neighboring areas began resurfacing. Similar consulting firms, identical language in filings, and comparable patterns of public confusion appeared across multiple cases. Individually, they had been dismissed as isolated conflicts. Viewed collectively, they suggested coordination. The association's meticulous records placed their situation squarely within that emerging pattern, giving regulators a clear starting point rather than a vague suspicion.
The property owner experienced an unexpected shift in tone from parties that had once applied pressure. Offers that hinted at compromise disappeared entirely, replaced by formal neutrality. Communication became cautious, measured, and indirect. It was not relief so much as confirmation that something unseen had changed. Those who had pushed hardest now seemed intent on leaving as little trace as possible. The association compiled supplemental documentation at the request of external reviewers, expanding its report to include historical context, procedural timelines, and evidence of consistent restraint. The emphasis was not on proving virtue, but on demonstrating continuity. Every decision could be traced back to established policy, every delay justified by precedent. There were no improvisations to exploit, no shortcuts to question. The woman who had been reduced to a caricature online continued operating within that same framework, but with a clearer understanding of her position. She was no longer simply maintaining order, she was preserving a record that might one day outlast the narrative surrounding her. That awareness changed nothing about her actions, but it changed how she perceived their significance.
As the third phase drew to a close, the conflict stood at an uneasy equilibrium. The property remained untouched, the association's authority intact, and the public still largely misinformed. What few realized was that the focus had shifted away from land entirely. The mechanisms that had attempted to manipulate the situation were now under scrutiny themselves, and the outcome would hinge not on outrage, but on documentation, patience, and time. The final turn had not yet revealed itself, but its approach was unmistakable. When it arrived, it would force a reassessment not only of who had gone too far, but of how easily restraint could be mistaken for guilt, until the full weight of truth made that illusion impossible to maintain. The resolution did not arrive with an announcement or a public reckoning, but with a sequence of quiet disclosures that reassembled the story in reverse. Regulatory findings were released incrementally, each one addressing a narrow procedural issue that seemed unremarkable on its own. Together, they outlined a pattern of coordinated misrepresentation that extended far beyond the original property dispute. Consulting reports were traced back to shared funding sources. Altered filings were matched to internal communications, and influence campaigns, once dismissed as speculation, became documented strategy. When the findings reached a threshold that could no longer be contained within administrative channels, the narrative finally shifted. Media attention followed the evidence rather than the outrage this time, and the story people thought they understood began to unravel. The association's early restraint, once framed as obstruction, was reinterpreted as insulation. The delays that had fueled suspicion were now recognized as safeguards that prevented irreversible damage while the truth assembled itself, piece by piece. The property owner was formally cleared of any ambiguity, not as a dramatic reversal, but as a confirmation of what had been true all along.
Title records were reaffirmed at the state level, third-party claims were invalidated, and the parcel was reclassified to prevent future speculative interference. What had been portrayed as contested land was officially recognized as an example of ownership preserved through adherence to process rather than force. Attention then turned to the systems that had attempted to bend that process. Development interests quietly withdrew from multiple pending projects, consulting firms dissolved or rebranded, and enforcement actions unfolded without spectacle. There were no arrests announced, no public apologies issued, and no villains marched forward for judgment. Accountability manifested as absence, as influence networks collapsed under scrutiny and left behind only documentation where confidence had once been. The woman whose name had become shorthand for excess never sought vindication. She did not issue statements, correct misconceptions, or reclaim the narrative that had reduced her to a symbol. Her role had never been to persuade, only to preserve. When asked internally whether the association should address the public shift in perception, she recommended against it. The record spoke clearly enough without commentary, and history, she believed, would do the rest. Residents slowly recalibrated their understanding as the noise subsided. The forums that once thrived on speculation went quiet, replaced by new controversies that offered easier outrage. What remained was an uneasy recognition that certainty had been assumed far too early, and that patience, though invisible, had carried more weight than reaction. The association's reputation did not dramatically improve, but it stabilized into something quieter and more durable than approval. The property itself returned to obscurity, unchanged and largely forgotten by those who had once argued over it. No development followed, no sudden transformation justified the conflict that had surrounded it. Its value had never been in what could be built there, but in what it revealed about the systems designed to protect ownership when pressure mounted. In that sense, it had served a purpose far beyond its boundaries. In hindsight, the title that had framed the story proved misleading in the most instructive way. Everyone had thought someone had gone too far, because escalation is easier to recognize than restraint. What the full record showed instead was how quickly order becomes suspect in an environment conditioned to expect abuse, and how easily protection can be mistaken for control when patience refuses to perform. The final understanding did not come with satisfaction, only clarity. There were no heroes elevated, no villains celebrated, and no moral victory declared. There was simply a corrected record, a preserved property, and a quiet acknowledgment that the loudest version of a story is rarely the most accurate. And long after attention moved on, the association continued operating exactly as it always had, unchanged by the narrative that briefly consumed it, confident that its purpose had never required approval to endure.